I got myself writing notes as you talked, but also as you talked and Ashley a little earlier. I liked that analogy of the firewood and the inability of the twigs to do all the cooking. We would love to do the cooking as opposed to just lighting the fire. But it's for me, the American is it the American people or is it the American government? It's an interesting maybe institution or the culture of the people because you kept on talking about trying to build a culture of best practices and things like that. But the more you look at, I don't think it's just American, it's many donors. Probably these are case studies of how not to, or case studies of bad practices. But then, in many cases, it's all these things. And some years ago, I remember interviewing an activist in Kenya, and he had been involved. He led a Muslim organization, and then the extraditions came. And he had no way of rationalizing why he would continue getting American money when his brothers and sisters are being extradited in the name of war on terror. And this is over 15 years down the line, and these particular conversations are still ongoing. And I wonder why can these things change, given the type of voices that you have? And I'm hoping that you're not a minority. Probably so many of you within this movement are asking these particular questions. But it's also your own conviction working in that particular space and the ecosystem. How do you take it? Probably these are moral, ethical questions around what we do as a people, but I think they have huge implications on what generally the type of things that we're trying to do. And I would love to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
The solidarity funding of ACT, and because I work with a number of movements, is highly valued and highly appreciated. It has helped the Swazi struggle at a difficult time and enabled the MSF also to come up with a strategy plan before Tulani was killed. And have accompanied some of those struggles. But I want to give an example. Recently you've given, I know where your grants go. Okay. So you recently were given a small grant to a small town in the Free State. In 2017, I accompanied a struggle there that saw the biggest mobilization since the 80s in this town on housing and other issues. And we spent 30,000 rand with participatory action research, ward mass meetings, political education, organizing strategy and tactics. And of course it was smashed by Ace Magashule and his thugs. It was set back quite substantially. A number of our, including some of us, our lives were in danger there because they'd take you out if you're going to expose a town that has been allocated money for housing and not one house has been built. But and if we had a little more resources to consolidate, to develop a proactive defensive strategy to manage that type of repression, the criminality element, that struggle could have advanced. And I want to bring it back to the region. We've come through a liberation struggle. And last night I was having a long discussion with someone who said, we worked really hard in the struggle. How much harder are we going to have to work now in order to build a mass that can challenge the current paradigm and work towards fundamental change? And I think we've got to recognize that the current funding models and solidarity into project delivery, by and large. And therefore, we've got to make a concerted effort to get money down into the ground, to have a parallel process of institutional development and funds for organizing strategy and tactics. Because in this region, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Swaziland, in Zimbabwe, and in South Africa, it can be bloody dangerous to be an activist. We had 25 activists killed, Abashani, Pastor Lindo. 3 activists were shot dead with the municipal elections in Mozambique, and now, with the election results coming out the way it is, we can expect more bloodshed. And Angola has got a very, very good security system, the same with Zimbabwe. 160 activists arrested before the Salak Summit. So I think we've got to be able to support activists to navigate that condition and to build the organization under very complex conditions. And we've got to do it parallel to institution building, so they can raise and manage funds and have participatory democracy, etc., etc. And then coming to the human rights defenders, and I think it's good that you're doing work with human rights defenders, but I'm not sure the extent to which you're reading the ground.
Yeah.
Whether during repression, we managed it at a community level. It became a community organizing aspect. And now the focus on the individual, which is good, they need the help, they need the relief, they need the counseling, etc. But what is the organizing strategy to navigate those repressive conditions? And what is the role of security in those struggles? And what resources can you provide? And what's your understanding of the context from that perspective?
Firstly, thank you to the panelists who are sitting in different spaces of the room. Yes, disruptive approach. And there's so much there, that lies in just the reflections. But I also want to affirm the whole idea of getting behind what we hear as small grants. And respectfully, when you hear big money, everybody then wants to find out, okay, can we have cocktails later, for example? But I think there's lacking of capacity when it comes to people in the NGO sector. And sometimes we must also acknowledge and be truthful that sometimes activists don't do well in managing grants. We have a long history in South Africa of activists who know how to do, activation work, but don't know how to manage monies. And that's why there's so much risk factor. I think, and complications that come like with big grant names like USAID, and again, we are speaking about grants, so I don't feel shy to say, like we were adopted at one time with a project by Danone, the Danone Development Fund. And here I won't mention the other partners, but there are partners that will dabble inside grants, especially big grants, that want to use them as income generating for what should be profit making costs. So, we work in the space where we see that kind of complication. And so when there comes to risk factors of whether it be a small grant or medium-sized grant, it's always afforded and how we can report back, whether it's in the logs and the twigs kind of language, which I love. The metaphor is amazing. But that's also the difficulty of the work, that small grants can only get you so far. And then how far can it get you? But I was wondering about this, what is a way in which that we can talk about an ethics of subversive, or otherwise known as making a plan to make things happen? Working in an under kind of radar that is actually ethically acclaimed. So, for example, if we talk about some of the things that are happening right now in Palestine, you can't even mention the topic in certain areas, because if you mention it to your funders or people that are coming in, depending on what ground they come from. And I like this idea of thinking about a subversive approach to creating a way that actually can be held to account, but not holding up the work. So I hope we can reflect on that. Thank you.
Convenings, I often wonder whether we're not speaking to the converted. You look around the room and it kind of feels like all of us on the same page. So we're kind of having a conversation that's, about an issue that we all, already agree on. And perhaps what we should be doing is to look at the next level of engagement. And I think for me, the next level of engagement is how do we find, I don't know, perhaps more effective strategies to engage donors, and maybe even try and segment the donors because we've got somebody an organization that's doing bilateral funding. But the strategy could be different for private foundations, for multilaterals, and so on and so forth. I think bilaterals tend to be the most restrictive because, in many ways, bilateral funding is government funding, and so we might find that it's an easier conversation when we segment the funders and engage them um, differently. I think one of the other things I just wanted to highlight is often when we talk about funding and getting money to grassroots level, and I think Act Bumbano is one good example of what we typically call an intermediary grant maker. I don't know whether you've characterized yourself as such, but an intermediary grant maker. But I think we must also be careful about how much we put an emphasis on one and not the other, because I think we exist as an ecosystem of grant makers or of civil society organizations trying to channel money to the ground. So I think, often, we have these conversations about should funding be going to blue chip NGOs? Should it be going to CBOs? Should it be going to movements? And in the process, we kind of segment ourselves and we're playing to the enemy, because when we're divided, they're better able to make it a competition amongst ourselves. And so I'm just wondering the extent to which we can embrace this whole system as an ecosystem and accept that it's not one or the other. I think there's room for small grants, there's room for big grants, there's room for NGOs, there's room for CBOs, there's room for movements, and there's even room for activists, individual activists. And so I often wonder how we can come together and perhaps work more collaboratively in trying to change donor practices. And I think we might be more effective in doing that. My last comment is we are a grant maker ourselves, very much similar to Actu Bumbano. And the only difference, and I had not appreciated the difference until now, is that we offer institutional support grants. So we don't offer program grants. So we give money to movements, to CBOs, to grassroots organizations, so that they can support their core, so that they can pay salaries, have space to work from, because our own experience has been that it's much easier for organizations to get programmatic funding, but a lot more difficult to get institutional support grants. So I'm just wondering, whether we shouldn't be working more collaboratively in the areas that work. If you are providing a program support grant and we are providing an institutional support grant to an organization like Kumbulania, an organization like Kumbulanis, I think that could be a very good complementary way of working and demonstrating the value of grassroots organizations. Thank you.
Sorry, I agree totally with what she just said. And working collaboratively with organizations like ourselves, you guys are sort of, the way I see it, is one step removed from the communities that you serve. Okay, you may just get retrospective on due diligence, what's being done. But we see the environment that you're trying to improve, and we have the insights and perspectives and awareness of the changing factors affecting the communities. And we will encourage these little, these CBOs or whatever to put through a proposal. But I think it's wise if we sort of can also recommend, if you get a recommendation from us with communities that we've supported in institutional support that we've provided in organizing at grassroots, and if they indicate they've received such support from ourselves or other organizations, that will be good for us to recommend or get a recommendation or proposal from ourselves to say, yes, we have provided some help, and can you help them with programmatic grant to take their matters forward, their movements forward? So I think that's a very good idea as well, because we're really working at grassroots level.
Firstly, I wanted to understand whether the model from Bumumbano works largely for the small scale organizations, CBOs, and assuming that it doesn't cover institutional support, as she was saying, broadly. I was hoping right from the beginning that one of the key features that probably the objective of Bumbano, the route that they are trying to take, is a transformation of those relations, but also, if I were to sit here, wake up and be reborn, and I've never experienced the granting mechanism that I have grown to know from Western countries, like the design of the funding, because that is the architecture that we are using. I was assuming that one of the fundamental intent of Bumbano was, how do you turn this thing upside down so that is impactful, so that is empowering to those who are supported, and especially at that level. I'm saying this precisely because while we should work in partnership, leveraging each other, what is the fundamental struggle that we are trying to append to transform this funding architecture? Because the objective reality, and I'm not saying it's not working, it's assisting in many places, but at the same time, it has actually changed the sector from what it was into something else. If that was an intent in a small contribution, one of the challenges that I'm facing with, I've been struggling for the past 18 months to set up a support mechanism, and I don't want to call it a grant. I thought when you were saying that you'll share the good name. But the question is, how then do you go about concretely? What are the critical lessons? Is it empowering? Because what I'm trying to set is to have a various layers, probably ranging from 75 upwards for the CBO, so that we don't make assumption that they don't need money, but covering, for example, institutional support, without creating, but as a mechanism that can we empower? In our mind at Kagiso Trust, we are talking about something that it can leverage, but at the same time, assisting in the overall transformation of the architecture she was saying earlier on, so that we can say there is a different way to support the sector, an empowering and sustainable way. That's what I'm still struggling. Probably I'll have some ideas at the end of this. Thank you.
Or contemporary grant making as fundamentally lazy. And a whole lot of people got really upset with me. And the reason I describe it as lazy is because if I look around, all of the same organizations are getting large amounts of money. And smaller organizations struggle to even get visibility in the space. And I understand the external pressures of back donor funding. I understand the external pressures of annual budgets and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, as grant makers at this level of grant making, your role is to know the field. Your role is to be able to say, when money comes in, I know exactly where it's going to go to, I know where it's needed, and I know the organizations that can create leverage in the system. Instead, grant makers go and look for who else has got money. They talk to other grant makers and say, who are you funding? They're good ones. They can spend the money, and they go put their money there. Fundamentally lazy. And so for me, that's the praxis question for this group, or for anybody who wants to talk about grant making, is how do we shift away from this idea that we will go to the known? We have to find, because the known is not delivering the change, people. Look around us. It's not happening. So how do we find the new, the quiet, the ones that are actually creating change in the world? And for me, that's the fundamental challenge of this conversation, not necessarily about how much you move, but how well you move money.
It's really hard coming after Alan. But earlier this year, we did something with an experimental fund where we're trying to set up funding for young people and shifting power literally. And we had donors now showboating for young people because usually it's us writing the proposals, telling them why we are the best people to be funded. But now we shifted the narrative for them to tell us why we want them to fund our work. What do you believe in? What are your values? Why is it important for you to fund the work that we do? And then the critical question that most donors struggled with was who decides? Because usually when we're funding, it's always, oh, well, we already have these set priorities for this region. But who decided those priorities? Was it the people on the table that said, well, this is an issue, now we have to prioritize this? When the actual things on the ground are different from what you're deciding. So donors struggled with that question. And then after we told them that we wanted to set up an experimental fund and fund the unknown, they were open to that idea because now they wanted to find out what else is out there. So I feel like what Alan said really resonates with me because we're always funding the things that everyone is saying. But then the other things that no one actually pays attention to. A donor that funded our organization actually looked at our Facebook page. We didn't even know them. And they wrote us a Facebook message saying, we are seeing the work that you're doing. Are you guys fully organized? Do you have any registration? Can we fund your work? And we're like, no, we're not registered. We're just a group of girls trying to do something. And for them, it was, well, we want to fund you, but we don't know how. So how can we work together to actually fund the work that you're doing? And that was in 2016. Coming back now, when they come and see they see Green Girls, they're like, wow, we were part of this and we're still part of this up to now. And you can see the difference that is happening. So why do donors not like taking the chance? Why not funding the things that everyone else is not funding, but will actually disrupt in communities?
Thank you, Jesse. Um, yeah, I think I'm also still formulating as people are speaking. But three different things that came up as the panelists spoke. When Ashley said communities know best how to resist their own dehumanization. And then also when our next speaker also spoke on that, Kumbulani, when you shared, supporting the local struggle. And then Amy, your important example of writing that proposal of getting that birthday cake. And I don't think we must take those things lightly because it speaks to relationships. And I think this is key for me. The relationships that are formed with the donors, with you as the grant makers, and then the community levels. And what I've seen often, for example, changing that narrative, that decolonial, moving from the colonial ideologies or the patriarchal ideologies or the heteronormative. And Ashley, you were talking a little bit about this, about what you three do in your group, at how you, I guess, speak to each other and challenge each other. Like, hey, you're missing this out, or maybe you must think about this again. And how can that be done, that approach be taken as well back to the donors? So the relationships that they experience with yourselves and them understanding a little bit better but what it means of why it is that birthday cake is important. And how does it relate to indirect ways of this activistic work that we want to support at the local level of what you were talking about. And for the Faith Action Collective, how we saw this playing out was inviting the donors to experience firsthand of what this means, of sitting in community, of being a part of it, and then saying, oh, okay, now I get it. Or I didn't understand why that birthday cake was important, but them being a part more of this. And I'm wondering if more of that could be done, or how are you doing that to be able to establish those relationships where we are moving from those ideologies of colonialism and patriarchy when it comes to funding. And just wondering if there's any ways. I think there's much creativity that we have to give and offer, and that needs to be tapped in more. You were saying it's more an art, and absolutely. So how can we harness that creativity that comes from the arts?
So I'm new to this space. I'm new to your context, and apologies for ignorance that might emerge from what I share or ask. So I'm struck by a kind of an either or element to the discussion. It's like it's got to be this way or it's got to be that way. And I think the twigs metaphor was beautiful because it said you need both. You need the logs and the twigs and the paper and the matches, and you need all of it. And you said that as well, right? So I'm not sure that people are lazy. I mean, yes, to some extent, but I also think that we talked this weekend about the dangers of funders always going after the new and not sticking with the 20-year struggles, the 30-year relationships. And so you have to also stay with the known and so I think that it's not only the novel, it's not only the institutional, it's got to be the institutional and the direct action. But another question, so I'm just struck by the either or nature of the conversation. I'm trying to figure out the question: are we brave enough to do what must be done? Who's the we? And then what must be done? It sits in so many different places because I think your your pond, Amy, is very different than Ashley's pond than um, Kumbalani's pond. Um, so, um, and one of the questions I had is maybe at what point does the system that makes it impossible to do this stuff become informed by it? So when you said, Amy, we can spend amazing stuff and not change anything, you were referring to maybe seeding local work that doesn't germinate and flourish. But I was actually thinking, well, yeah, then after 40, after the 45 million are gone, USAID goes back to every other form of, funding that it had before. So I'm thinking, what, again, it's about the either or. It's not, it's and this and then influencing that. It's a little bit what you were saying as well. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Is how do you bring them into the conversation so that the bigger system is shifted by the practice as well as changing the practice? You can go now, Alan.
What I wanted to comment on, and I do agree, it's the either or. It limits us to choosing. I don't think that is the dynamic. But someone made a comment and says, how can it be both empowering but also sustainable? Empowering meaning ownership, meaning the credibility and the originality of what the need on the ground is, to be able to be seen for what it is. So I think that the conversation that I think Sis Bongi was saying, we are all the converted in this room, whether we think we're either the twigs or the other way. But I think the conversation really should be moved to the next level, where using the analogy of being maybe lazy in the sense that the people doing intermediary work and whatever it is, I don't know if so much lazy, but it's hard work. So it's the brevity to actually expose what's happening, who's actually doing the work, to stand back and allow the people, the actors, the human rights defenders, the people actually doing the work, like people have organized themselves and are getting things done. So when we talk about the small grants, it's because visibly it makes a difference. But how sustainable is are the grants? And like we've been pointed out, is that the sustainability of creating institutions that can now march parallel funding on their own. And so we've been doing quite a bit of research around the whole intermediary space. And I think for me, the brevity is to allow the people doing the work to then become direct recipients, where we step back and build institutionally that parallel ability for them to become recipient, whatever that would look like, whether it's us doing more work. So to try to translate the laziness that Alan speaks about, is because it takes hard work to create these parallel institutional infrastructure where there's nothing, no registration. Someone has a Facebook page and you say what you're doing. It takes more hand holding, mentoring. So whether it's called intermediary fiscal hosting, it's hard work. And so the brevity for us to do that hard work or to step out and allow them to be completely connected to the powers that be. So that the engaging of the donors and the funders is now for me that level of how willing are they to actually look at the different forms of funding. Thank you.
This is an entirely ungovernable room in all the best ways. I have two questions because you're all touching on all the issues that keep me awake at night. So the first is I wanted to respond to this idea of knowing the field, because you're absolutely right that if our project is to shift power, we have to know the field, because we have to move away, at least partially, from, and I'm saying partially so that we can make space for the multiplicity of approaches, from the usual suspects. But the other problem is that there's a danger with that, because we need to simultaneously do that in ways that don't perpetuate the very same problems that we're also trying to move away from, which is around gatekeeping. Because that's the other part of shifting power, is that we need to make sure that we don't just position ourselves as the new set of gatekeepers. So I'm curious as to kind of people's experience with that and things that we've tried. I mean, I know these are questions that we've grappled with at EJF a lot about this, about wanting to experiment with new forms of participatory grant making and setting up an activist grants committee that makes decisions, and then also wanting to do open calls as part of that, so that a tiny little organization from Port Nolloth that's never been connected into anywhere can apply and get a grant. But that then opens you up to the hundreds of applications that then come in that your tiny little team must now process. And like simultaneously trying to map the sector with your same tiny little team. But I'm curious as to people's experience about how we simultaneously know the field and don't insert ourselves as the new gatekeepers. And then the second question is, Khumbulani, I wanted to come back to your idea of graduation, because that's also the $1 million question, right? And we debate often about this idea of deep versus wide. It's always the question that occupies people, but sort of the landscape of next, the world of next, and I'm interested in what that's, if you guys have thought about that, like what would graduation look like, and what happens to graduates in a sort of ideal world, not necessarily in relation to ACT, but just in general, your sort of thoughts or ideas on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd also wanted to engage with Alan's around laziness. In fact, when Alan started speaking, I thought he would mention exactly the opposite, that we should know our sector well enough for us not to be putting out calls for proposals. I didn't realize he was going to suggest that we sort of talk to each other and ask who's funding who. I haven't had that experience, Alan. I haven't had any of the colleagues in the room ask, who are you funding? And therefore, who could we fund? And we haven't done the same. But in fact, I've worried about the opposite. I've worried about how much money we spend in calls for proposals and the due diligence process and so on and so forth, ending up with far less money getting to the ground. But one of the things, a couple of things I wanted to just reflect on. So we often talk about sustainability and growth. And I often wonder whether that should be a goal, We talk about sustainability as if it's got to be sustainability for sustainability's sake, For me, sustainability has got to be about continued relevance of the organizations that we're funding. So we must be careful in putting money and more money and multiple grants, multi-year grants, and talking about sustainability in that sense, because the sustainability has got to be linked to the responsiveness to the issues. And some of these issues are changing all the time, So if you are funding an organization, one of the colleagues spoke about what happened during COVID. I think it was you actually, Ashley, who spoke about taking money back during COVID. We fought with our funders and our grantee partners during COVID, because we said, there was a scope of work that needed to be completed. COVID happened, it could happen. But we said, surely there must be a lot of other things that are happening in your communities right now that you could actually be responding to. And for me, the organizations that sort of stood and said, we can't do the work because there's restrictions. It felt like they were not being responsive to the moment. It felt like, they were playing the violin on the Titanic. Everybody's sinking, and you sort of continue. You're playing the violin, and yet there's an immediate crisis that you could be responding to, and using your infrastructure and your proximity to communities to respond, to the issue at hand. So I suppose I just wanted to talk about the issue of sustainability. The last bit I want to talk about is, you spoke about organizations. I think it's Amy. You spoke about organizations that have said, we can't take your money because we don't believe in your politics, right? And I want to challenge us. Our politics are very similar. Our funding is political, as you said, Ashley. Our politics are very much similar around the social justice sector. And maybe if we came together and boldly said, we're not taking your money because we don't believe in your politics, and it should start with us. You're speaking about small organizations who've done that. Big, thumbs up to them. I think that's very brave. And I think we should also be pushing back in a more united way, because when we push back individually, they just go and find somebody else, right? They just go and find somebody else, and we perpetuate those practices. But I think we must be coming together and having a more solid and unified voice in saying, we will not accept these funding practices as intermediary grant makers on the continent. And therefore, unless you're prepared to shift, you can take your money elsewhere. We must have that brevity.